Twice a year, ruby-throated hummingbirds make this incredible journey, first in the fall and then in the spring. And while this may seem like a regular event, I want you to put it in perspective for a minute what this really involves. This is thousands of miles of tiny little birds traveling. And in some cases, some of them are choosing to cross the Gulf of Mexico. And the span from New Orleans to the Yucatan Peninsula, which is kind of a direct route right there, is about 500 miles. In terms of flying time for a hummingbird, that's about 18 to 20, even 24 hours. That's straight flying, no stops, no nectar feeders, nothing. They're just beating those tiny little wings furiously for 20 or so hours. So when you really think about it and all the threats that are involved, I mean, there's predators, there's high winds, there's getting lost, there's so many things that can happen along the way, plus just being tired or running out of energy. So when you think about this and the fact that they're doing this twice a year, it's almost like a miracle. So what I wanted to do in this episode was just talk about the things that we can do to help them on their journey. The first thing we can do is just understand and be really aware. And I think that, this video might be a first step here because it kind of teaches you the perspective about, hummingbird migration, or the ruby-throated hummingbird's migration is not just like zipping across and heading down south for a vacation. It's really intense and it's really energy consuming. So just making ourselves aware, and there's lots of ways, watching YouTube videos, looking up things online. Also, a great resource I wanted to point out, just because I use this a lot in doing some of the research, is Stan Tequila's Bird Migration book. This book has so much information, not just about hummingbirds, but bird and bird migration and the complexities in general. And the other thing is, it is just filled with beautiful photography, and this is mostly his photography. There's a few stock images that he uses, but in general, all of it is his work. And so it's a really cool book. I will have it linked in the description. Another great resource to look at is the website called The Journey North, and I'll link that also in the description. But that gives you so much more information about the hummingbird migration in general, and ways that you can get involved. The next thing we can do is just be mindful of our garage doors and keeping them shut. I saw a post from a bird rehab facility about this topic, and I never really thought about it before, but before juveniles begin migration, they get curious about the world around them and start to explore, and sometimes that means inside garages. So if you're one who leaves your garage doors open during the spring and fall migration windows, just consider keeping them closed, or closed as much as possible. Not to mention, during the nesting season, which is spring and summer, I've heard of Carolina wrens getting inside and nesting within, and that brings on a whole new level of complication. A really fun thing to think about when it comes to migration is this idea of a stopover site. And a great analogy for that is, imagine taking a long road trip and you take a rest stop. You use the bathroom, you hit the vending machine, you stretch your legs. A stopover site is kind of like that. Or, another analogy on a road trip is you stop over for the night and you get a hotel room and you continue your journey. So with hummingbirds and other migrating birds, if they're coming, especially from far northern areas, they're going to hit different places in order to rest. And so one of the things we can do is work on making our backyard a nice stopover site for them. And, we can do that with nectar feeders, but we can also do that with plants and things like that. And just giving coverage, if they have a nice spot to rest, to perch and hide from predators and kind of keep warm on those colder nights, that makes it a nice spot. So when you think about your own backyard, and not just for hummingbirds, but for other migrating birds too, think about ways or research ways that you can make it a really nice stopover site. And part of that is just building that habitat out too. To add to this, planting native plants is my next tip. The reason this is so important, especially for hummingbirds, is that while they'll drink nectar from pretty much any flower that provides it, whether it's native or non-native, when it comes to bugs and the insects that they mostly eat native insects. And in order to encourage native insects, you need native plants. Part of the thing with native plants is that there are host plants to certain insects. And a great example of this is the milkweed for the monarch. The monarch will lay its egg on milkweed plant, the caterpillar will hatch and start eating and growing and basically living out that early life stage on the milkweed. Then it'll do its cocoon, it'll metamorph, and it'll turn into a butterfly. The same is true for a lot of other different types of species of plants and different species of bugs. And so in order to encourage native bug growth, we need native plants. So it's really important. And I'm not zealous about this. I don't demand that everybody has only exclusively native plants, but it is something important to incorporate in your landscaping. If you're wondering what native plants you should plant, especially for hummingbirds, the Audubon has a great resource where you put in your zip code, and then you can also put in the types of bird that you want to attract, and it'll give you a native plant suggestion for your area and for the birds that you're trying to attract. The next really important thing, and this goes back to, encouraging bugs and making your home or your backyard a good stopover site, is to avoid using pesticides. And I'm also meaning mosquito spray. And I don't mean so much like just your off bug spray that you would use. And you can see right here, I have all my mosquito bracelets on. I have my citronella candle burning. The mosquitoes are crazy. But what I mean is, don't have your yard fogged. Don't spray something around your yard. And while some people may say, well, it's not toxic, it won't hurt your animals, or it may say it's for mosquitoes, a lot of these sprays are not selective. They're very broad and they end up killing everything, all the bugs. And so what you end up doing is cutting off that food supply. And for hummingbirds, while they're migrating, they are really going to be feeding on that nectar and building their fat reserves. But they will also need a little bit of bugs here and there, and that's for the protein as well. So avoiding pesticides is all around a good idea. And there's ways to survive. You use your mosquito bracelets, citronella candles. I also have a fan blowing, and that really helps. So there's ways to survive outside of spraying. It is really important when you are hosting hummingbirds to keep your nectar feeders clean and routinely change out that sugar water. Really think about this. Sugar and sugar water is a great breeding ground for bacteria and fungus. And I mean, you think about it, like if you had a cup of Kool-Aid out or fruit punch or something like that, and you just left it out for like a couple days, or you left it outside in the heat for a couple days, it would look pretty gross. And I imagine you would not want to drink that. Well, the same goes for hummingbirds. When those nectar feeders get dirty, what can happen with the hummingbirds is they end up getting basically an infection. They eat that dirty bacterial water and they get an infection. It can also cause their tongues to swell up. There's been rehab facilities that have gotten hummingbirds in that are sick due to bad, dirty feeders. And so we really want to encourage cleaning feeders. I read an article called Loving Hummingbirds to Death, and they say that 1,000 hummingbirds a year are killed due to dirty feeders. I can't find any other articles or anything else that backs that up or corroborates it, but again, based on some of the things that have come from other rehab facilities and things that are being shared around lately, I don't doubt it either. So it's really important to keep those feeders clean. Something you can also do is just have clean hummingbird feeders on standby. They're not being used, they're totally empty, but they're already clean. And so when you're ready to swap out, if you're not ready to clean it right away, you can just throw it in the sink, dump it out, rinse it out, throw it in the sink, get the clean one ready, pour in your sugar water, and then mount that, outside on a pole or whatever. And then clean it later, and that's your new standby feeder, your pre-existing one. As far as when to change your feeders or how often, there's been some things like Perky Pet has a guide on based on the temperature, how often, but something new came out recently. I don't have the link anymore. I found this on social media and I think it came from the Audubon, but it was suggesting that you basically want to change your feeders out every other day as a baseline, and when it's really hot, go every day. Change those feeders out every day. And part of that is not just the bacterial growth, but also hummingbird preference. They like clean, fresh feeders. So that's something to think about when it comes to feeding hummingbirds and helping them prepare for migration. Something that we should all do is avoid red dyes and commercial type nectar. The red dyes are not good for hummingbirds. They're not good for birds. I think even for people, the red dyes are starting to be kind of like, you want to kind of avoid them. But it's not good, and thankfully there's more awareness out there. I'm sure some of you already know this too, to avoid the red dyes, and you don't need it either. Instead, just go with sugar water, and it's just 4 parts water to 1 part sugar. All you need is white sugar. Never use honey, don't use brown sugar, just use white sugar. And the reason not to use honey or brown sugar or something like that is it can actually really grow that bacteria very quickly. So sugar and water is the best way to go. You also don't want to mess around with that ratio, the 4 parts water to 1 part sugar. Anything more than that, as far as sugar goes, and the bacteria will go crazy. And anything less than that, and the hummingbirds may not like it as much. Another thing you can do is just increase your feeders during the migration period. If you don't get an influx, if you're not having a lot of customers, if you're not having a lot of hummingbirds coming to your feeders, you can pull back. You don't need to provide so many. But if you're getting a lot of hummingbirds coming, to reduce that tension and fighting and give them options, have multiple feeders out. Something that can happen during migration is some hummingbirds get injured, or something delays their migration, or they can't put on the weight that they need to and they're still trying to bulk up for migration, and they end up getting delayed, or they don't make it and they get stranded. And so this next tip for our migrating hummingbirds is to look out for our stragglers, the ones who aren't able to migrate. Even after the height of hummingbird season, leave your hummingbird feeders out. So I would say even in November, have a hummingbird feeder out. If you observe a hummingbird stopping by, maybe you have an empty hummingbird feeder, I would leave the empty hummingbird feeder out because a lot of them are trained to use them. So leave it out. And if you see a hummingbird coming by, maybe it's December and it's freezing out, start adding hummingbird nectar out for that guy. He may not be able to go any further south. That might be it for him. He's stranded, and he has a good chance of survival if there's nectar available, because that nectar, that sugar water, allows him to take any excess sugar, and that his body will convert that into fat, and he can live and survive off of that fat, especially when it's really cold out. There are some hummingbirds out west that do not migrate, so this excludes them, but specifically for hummingbirds that are migrating, if you observe one in December or January, and it's snowing and it's crazy out, what you can do also is call your state's Audubon Society or a local rehabber and just get some advice. A lot of them are going to advise you to keep nectar out, keep it thawed. Those things will help that hummingbird survive. And again, advice is always a good thing to get. Keeping cats indoors is also really important. And if you watch some of my other videos, you'll hear me say that. Cats are not native to North America, and I mean house cats. I don't mean like bobcats or things like that, but house cats are not native to North America, and they don't play a role in the ecosystem, and they have had such a negative impact on the bird population. Now, I know that I sound really preachy, so I do want to say that I love cats. I have cats. I have fostered cats. I really, really do love cats. So I care about them, and I also think that, at least for me personally, keeping them indoors is good for their safety and well-being. Just knowing enough about nature. There's just so much that could happen to them if they're left outdoors. Now, if you're in a situation like you have a farm or something like that, cats play an important role there. Just keep them spayed and neutered. If you're really opposed to this, or your cat is addicted to the outdoors and he will yell at you if you don't let him out, at least put like a bell on his collar, because that noise can help warn the birds and scare them off and give them a chance. But for hummingbirds, I mean, they're swift, but hummingbirds are susceptible to cats too. And so by keeping them indoors or safeguarding our birds from cats gives them a better chance of survival. And during the migration period, whether it's hummingbirds or other birds, it gives cats a lot more opportunities, and we don't want that. Again, if we're being good stewards of our backyards and we're being good bird hosts, we want to make sure that we're giving our birds, our native birds anyway, the best chance for success. Minimizing window strikes, bird window strikes, is another thing that we can do to help our migrating hummingbirds and just our backyard birds in general. If you're not familiar with what a window strike is, it's when a bird collides with a window. And part of the reason this happens is because the window can reflect the outdoors, and the birds have a hard time telling whether that's a tree or apparently it's a barrier, and they collide with it. The thing about birds and window strikes is that often people will observe a bird hit the window, be dazed, and then fly off. What they don't notice is that after they fly off, a lot of times they die. And it can be internal bleeding, it could be injury, but a lot of them don't make it. So we want to minimize this, and there's a lot of ways we can do this. There are window stickers that you can use. You can do horizontal taping on your windows. There are daubers that you can use. So you daub your window with a UV dauber on the outside. Downside with the daubers or any kind of like paint, UV paint, is that if it rains, it could come off very easily, so you have to reapply. The American Bird Conservancy website also has some resources on how to minimize window strikes, and also has some resources on different products that you can use and even the effectiveness. And a lot of things aren't super effective, but doing something versus doing nothing is always good. If you do observe a bird who has hit a window, especially a hummingbird, but any bird in general, always call a rehabber, because they may encourage you to bring it in, or they may give you some advice like hold it for 24 hours and observe, or bring it in if you observe this. So always call a rehabber. Even if the rehabber isn't local, call, because if you need to bring it in, sometimes they have volunteers and they can arrange transport for your bird. Citizen science efforts are another big thing that we can do to help our migrating hummingbirds and migrating birds in general. And what I mean by this is that there are different organizations out there like eBird and Nest Watch and the Journey North, where we can provide data and observations, and in turn that's provided to researchers, and they can learn more about migratory behavior, the health of birds, the bird counts, things like that. So it's a great idea to participate in those kinds of things, and it's really easy to do. So eBird is a good option, Nest Watch is a good option, and the Journey North also has some options where you can participate and give them data. So by us participating, it can make a big difference in research. With these tips for helping migrating hummingbirds, some of you might be wondering about turning the lights out for their migration. So I wanted to talk about that really quick. Hummingbirds migrate by day, except for when they cross the Gulf of Mexico, where a portion of that journey will take place at night. The advice for turning lights out for migrating birds would really apply to night migrators, which many species of birds do migrate by night. The Audubon has been working really hard to drum up more awareness about how light can affect night migrators and encourage building managers to keep building lights off during this time. So turning out the lights is a good general tip to help many species of migrating birds. It may not apply though so much for hummingbirds. The Gulf can get a bit of light pollution, but it's nothing quite as heavy as on land near major cities. Something that I really want to drive home with all of this is that when it comes to our backyards, we are supposed to be the stewards. When we're hosting birds, it's not just so we can enjoy watching birds. If we're going to host birds, we have an obligation and responsibility to take care of them too. And unfortunately, a lot of times without proper education or doing things quite right, things can go bad for birds. There's been a lot of things where our involvement, because it isn't guided, hurts birds more than it helps birds. So always take time to learn, always ask for advice. That is the purpose of this entire channel, is to educate and teach us how to level up our backyard birding by becoming really good stewards of native wildlife. So if that interests you, definitely subscribe. But overall, that's how we should see ourselves, as stewards of our backyards. And when it comes to our migrating hummingbirds, creating a backyard that is a nice sanctuary and a stopover for hummingbirds is really going to help them along the way. One of the great things you can do is just observe your hummingbirds overall, because it is so cool. Year over year, you're going to find different things out, and learning firsthand through what you see is just, not only does it teach you something, but it brings you so much closer to nature, and it gives you such a different respect for it.